Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to explore a tense and emotional moment in the story of Toan and Tu Diem, when Tu Diem suddenly falls ill at night, forcing Toan to step into danger alone just to save the person he loves. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. After Thu's mother left, the yard fell into an unusual quiet. Her gentle words still lingered in the air, but the sky had already darkened. Toan and Tu Diem put away the remaining tools, then walked into the kitchen together. Dinner that night was simple. No one spoke much. Toan sat across from her, eating slowly while watching her closely. Tu Diem barely touched her food. She took small bites, paused often, and set her chopsticks down as if she had lost her appetite entirely. After a moment, Toan asked in a low voice, "You're not hungry?" Tu Diem shook her head. "No, I don't really feel hungry today." Her answer was calm, almost casual, but it made Toan hesitate. He did not ask further. He told himself she was probably exhausted after the long day. When the meal ended, Tu Diem stood up and washed the dishes as usual. Her movements were slower than normal, her shoulders slightly slumped. When everything was done, she turned toward Toan. "I feel a bit tired. I think I'll go to bed early." Toan nodded. He watched her walk into the room. A faint sense of unease passed through him, but he brushed it aside. She was likely just tired. He decided to sleep early as well. The room was dark and quiet. After a while, Toan sensed something unusual beside him. At first, it was subtle. Then it became more obvious. He turned his head. Tu Diem was curled inward, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Toan." Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. He sat up immediately and turned on the light. Her face was flushed, unnaturally red. He placed his hand on her forehead. It burned. "You have a fever." His voice tightened. He rushed to get a towel, soaked it with water, and gently placed it on her forehead. His hands trembled as he searched through their bags for medicine. Nothing, not a single fever reducer remained. He returned to the bed. "Stay here. I'll go buy medicine." Despite her weakness, Tu Diem shook her head. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve. "Don't go. It's dark. The road is dangerous." Toan looked at her. He understood her fear, but he also felt the heat of her skin beneath his hand. He bent closer and spoke softly, steadying his voice. "I'll be back quickly. Just wait for me. Trust me." He grabbed a jacket and hurried out the door. The road at night was far quieter than during the day. Toan walked fast, his breathing shallow. His thoughts were fixed on one thing only: buying medicine and getting home as soon as possible. As he reached the narrow road leading toward the market, he suddenly heard the sharp screech of brakes. The sound cut through the silence, making him stop in his tracks. Ahead, a motorbike wobbled and came to a halt. From the darkness, a man stepped forward and blocked its path. A knife glinted in his hand. The woman on the bike panicked. Her trembling voice broke out. "What are you doing?" The man moved closer, gripping the knife tightly. There was no one else around. This road was usually quiet and at night almost deserted. Toan stood several steps away. He immediately understood what was happening. His heart pounded. For a brief moment, fear took hold of him. He knew intervening was dangerous, but walking away was not an option. He drew in a deep breath and shouted loudly, "The police are patrolling ahead." His voice echoed down the empty road. The man froze, eyes darting around. Hearing someone nearby, hearing the word police, panic flashed across his face. After a brief hesitation, he dropped the knife, jumped onto his bike, and sped away into the darkness. The woman nearly collapsed. Toan ran forward and steadied her bike. "Are you okay?" She gasped for breath, her face pale. "Thank you. If it weren't for you." She looked at him more closely, noticing his thin jacket and the sweat soaking his back. "Why are you out so late?" Toan answered honestly, without hesitation. "I'm going to buy medicine. Someone at home has a high fever." The woman paused, then said, "I'm a doctor." Toan looked up sharply. "Get on," she continued. "I'll take you back. I'll check on her. Consider it my way of thanking you." He nodded immediately, wasting no time. When they arrived, the woman went straight into the room. She checked Tu Diem's temperature, asked a few questions, and examined her carefully. After a moment, she spoke calmly. "It's just a fever from being under the sun too long. Nothing serious." She took medicine from her bag and handed it to Toan. "Give her 1 dose now. Save the other 4 for tomorrow." Toan reached for his wallet, but she shook her head. "No need." Tu Diem, weak but conscious, asked why. The woman smiled and explained what Toan had done on the road. Tu Diem turned to look at Toan, her eyes filling with tears. The woman excused herself and left. Before she went, Toan and Tu Diem reminded her to take the main road and avoid empty paths. When the door closed, Tu Diem began to cry. She clutched Toan's hand tightly. "From now on, please don't go out at night anymore. If something happened to you, I couldn't survive it." Toan gave a small smile and pulled her into his arms. He held her close and whispered reassurance. He told her to rest. She eventually fell asleep. Toan stayed awake, sitting beside her. His mind raced with thoughts about how fragile everything was, how easily things could fall apart. The room slowly returned to silence after Tu Diem drifted back to sleep. Her breathing became steadier, no longer shallow or uneven. Toan remained seated beside the bed, his back resting lightly against the wall, his eyes never leaving her face. The small lamp was just bright enough for him to notice even the slightest change in her expression. He reached out again and placed his hand gently on her forehead. The fever had clearly gone down. His hand lingered, careful not to wake her. Only then did Toan allow himself to release a deep breath. The tightness in his chest had not faded. Images from the road replayed in his mind. The knife in the robber's hand. The moment the man turned to look at him, 1 second slower, and everything could have gone differently. The thought sent a chill through him. He looked at Tu Diem. She was sleeping now, her eyelashes still damp with tears. Toan lowered his head. He realized how used he had become to holding everything together, to being strong, to not allowing himself to appear weak. But tonight he understood clearly. If anything had happened to him, the one who would suffer most was her. Outside, the night moved slowly. A faint breeze slipped through the door. Toan did not sleep. He sat there, thinking about the life ahead, about the unfinished house, about the dangers they might face at any moment. Near midnight, Tu Diem stirred. She frowned slightly, then opened her eyes. It took her a moment to realize where she was. She lifted her hand to her forehead, touching it gently. The burning heat was gone. She turned her head. Toan was still there. "You haven't slept?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse. Toan looked at her and nodded. "I'm just sitting here." Tu Diem pushed herself up slowly. Her body was still weak, but her mind was clearer now. She looked at Toan for a long moment. His eyes were sunken from exhaustion, yet his attention was still fixed on her, just as it had been before. I feel better, she said quietly. Toan placed a hand on her shoulder. Good. Rest a bit more. She did not lie down right away. Instead, she reached for his hand and pulled it closer. His hand felt colder than hers. She held it tightly, as if afraid to let go. I was really scared earlier, she said. Toan did not answer immediately. He knew she was not talking about the fever. She was talking about him going out into the night. I kept thinking, what if you didn't come back? Her voice faltered, unable to continue. Toan lowered his head. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close. This time, he did not comfort her with words. He held her firmly, enough for her to feel that he was still here. I'm sorry, Toan said quietly. Tu Diem shook her head against his chest. I don't need you to risk your life for me. Toan remained silent. After a moment, he spoke. But I can't stand watching you suffer and doing nothing. The words were simple, but they were enough to make Tu Diem cry again. Not loudly, just silent tears soaking into his shirt. They stayed that way for a long time. No one rushed, no one wanted to break the moment. Eventually, Tu Diem rested her head on Toan's shoulder. Her breathing slowly steadied. Her eyes closed, but she did not fall asleep immediately. Next time, if something happens, she whispered, can we think it through together? Toan nodded. Yes, together. This time his voice was firm. Outside, insects hummed softly. The night no longer felt as heavy as before. Toan adjusted the blanket and helped Tu Diem lie down more comfortably. He did not leave. He stayed close, one hand resting on the edge of the bed. After a while, Tu Diem fell asleep again. This time, her sleep was deeper. Toan watched her for a long time until he was certain her breathing was completely calm. Only then did he lean back against the wall and close his eyes for a brief moment. Even so, his hand remained close enough to touch her. Near dawn, Tu Diem woke once more. The sky outside had not fully brightened yet. She shifted slightly and noticed Toan asleep in a sitting position, his head tilted to one side. A faint smile appeared on her lips. She reached out and gently touched his hand. Toan opened his eyes immediately. How are you feeling? He asked. I'm okay now, she replied, her voice much lighter than before. They looked at each other. There was no fear left, no panic, only the quiet certainty of the other's presence. Tu Diem leaned against Toan. He wrapped his arm around her and held her there. Outside, the sky began to change color. No one spoke about tomorrow, but both of them knew that after this night, they would no longer treat danger as something distant. They would be more careful, and they would be closer. An open ending. Not because everything was resolved, but because they had chosen to stay together, no matter what came next.
Sau khi mẹ Thu rời đi, Toàn và Từ Diễm trở lại nhịp sinh hoạt thường ngày. Tuy nhiên, Toàn sớm nhận ra điều bất thường khi Từ Diễm ăn rất ít và nhanh chóng xin đi ngủ. Đến đêm, Toàn phát hiện Từ Diễm lên cơn sốt cao. Trong lo lắng, anh quyết định ra ngoài mua thuốc dù đường tối và nguy hiểm. Trên đường, Toàn bất ngờ chứng kiến một vụ cướp và mạo hiểm can thiệp để cứu một người phụ nữ. May mắn thay, người đó là bác sĩ và đã quay về nhà giúp anh chăm sóc Từ Diễm kịp thời. Sau biến cố, Từ Diễm bật khóc vì sợ mất Toàn, còn anh lặng lẽ ở bên cạnh cô suốt đêm. Cơn sốt qua đi, để lại một đêm đầy suy nghĩ và tình cảm sâu sắc giữa hai người.